On 24 November 1805, the Allied army was gathered at Olmütz, northeast of Vienna. It had not yet committed itself to battle. Kutuzov could continue withdrawing toward the Carpathians, while other officers considered routes into Hungary or Bohemia. Each option offered the same advantage: more time. Time could bring Russian reinforcements closer, connect the army with other Austrian forces, and draw Napoleon farther from the territory already occupied by the French. The Allies had lost Vienna, but their main field army still existed. They were not surrounded, and no immediate military necessity forced them to attack. The decision, however, did not belong to a single commander. Kutuzov could recommend withdrawal, but Tsar Alexander had come to the army in person and possessed the coalition's strongest political authority. Austria had lost its capital and faced its own pressure to recover the initiative. At Allied headquarters, the value of delay would therefore be measured against more than conditions on a map. The council at Olmütz marked the point at which the discussion began moving away from how to preserve the army and toward how to use it against Napoleon. 8 days later, that choice would place the Allies on the ground near Austerlitz. Why did they choose the battle Napoleon needed them to fight? Napoleon entered this crisis from a position that looked stronger than it was. At Ulm, he had surrounded and forced the surrender of a major Austrian army. On 14 November, French troops entered Vienna. Yet neither success had destroyed the coalition's ability to continue the war. Kutuzov had escaped with the Russian field army. By withdrawing east, he preserved the force Napoleon most needed to defeat. Near Olmütz, it could join fresh Russian formations and surviving Austrian units. Other Austrian armies remained active, while Prussia's intentions were uncertain. The French position grew more difficult with every mile. Napoleon had advanced deep into enemy territory, leaving troops behind to guard roads, bridges, cities, depots, prisoners, and communications. The army available for a single battle was therefore smaller than the force that had begun the campaign. Davout and Bernadotte were still moving toward the main concentration, and winter was approaching. The coalition could exchange territory for time. Napoleon could not do so indefinitely. If the Allies continued east, French communications would lengthen, reinforcements could gather, and another power might enter the war before Napoleon secured a political settlement. Ulm had removed one army. Vienna had taken one capital. Neither had ended the war. To convert those victories into a decision, Napoleon still needed the Allied army to stop retreating and fight. That urgency did not exist on the Allied side. Retreat did not mean abandoning the campaign. It offered a way to change the conditions under which the next battle would be fought. By moving farther east, the army could approach Russian reinforcements and draw nearer to Austrian forces beyond Napoleon's immediate reach. Every day of delay could increase Allied strength, while forcing the French to protect a longer line behind them. Winter added to the pressure. French troops needed food, shelter, replacements, and secure roads across territory Napoleon did not fully control. The farther they followed, the harder it would become to keep their forces concentrated. Withdrawal carried costs. Austria would lose more territory, political confidence might weaken, and coalition coordination could become harder. Kutuzov also could not know exactly what Napoleon intended. His preference for retreat was not a prediction of every French move. Its logic was simpler. The Allies did not need to defeat Napoleon immediately. they could wait until their position improved and his became harder to sustain. Militarily, time remained an Allied resource. The question was whether the coalition's political leaders were willing to use it. At Olmütz, the Allied army had a commander, but it did not possess a single center of authority. Kutuzov was the nominal commander-in-chief. He had the experience to judge the danger of advancing against Napoleon, and he could recommend further withdrawal. Yet Tsar Alexander was present with the army. As sovereign, he held a political authority that no general could openly ignore. Kutuzov remained responsible for military advice and battlefield command, but he did not have complete freedom to decide whether the coalition would retreat or seek battle. Austria brought another set of pressures. Emperor Francis had lost his capital, and his government could not consider the campaign only from the perspective of preserving the Russian army. Continued withdrawal meant surrendering more Austrian territory and allowing Russian priorities to determine the pace of the war. Francis did not design the battle plan, but Austrian interests made delay harder to defend. The decision to attack then required a military form. That task fell largely to Franz von Weyrother, an Austrian staff officer. He did not single-handedly force the coalition into battle. He translated the growing preference for action into a plan that commanders could attempt to execute. Political authority, formal command, national interest, and operational planning were therefore divided among different men. The coalition could still issue orders, but changing direction required more than a military judgment. Before the battle began, that division had already narrowed the space available for caution. By late November, the Allies were not looking at an imaginary weakness. Much of what they saw was real. Napoleon was far from France, with troops dispersed across occupied territory. His available strength near Brünn appeared lower than the forces gathering against him. His right wing, stretching south toward Telnitz and Sokolnitz, was thin. Davout's Third Corps was still marching toward the battlefield and could not yet be counted among the troops already in position. French movements reinforced that impression. Near Wischau, Allied troops had pushed back French advance elements. Napoleon withdrew from some forward positions instead of contesting every mile. He did not establish his main defense on the Pratzen Heights, allowing the Allies to occupy the most prominent ground in the area. Diplomatic contact pointed in the same direction. Through Savary and the meeting with Prince Dolgorukov, Napoleon appeared willing to discuss an armistice. These exchanges did not prove that the French army was collapsing, but they fitted the interpretation already gaining influence at Allied headquarters. Napoleon was outnumbered, uncertain, and trying to avoid battle until his missing forces arrived. That interpretation contained enough truth to be persuasive. The French right was vulnerable. Reinforcements were still moving. Napoleon did want the Allies to believe he was cautious. The deception worked because it confirmed what the Allied headquarters already wanted to believe. Once the Allies accepted the belief that Napoleon's right was weak, the next step appeared logical. Wayrother's plan concentrated much of the army against the French southern flank. The leading columns would descend from the Pratzen Heights toward Telnitz and Sokolnitz. After clearing the villages and crossing the streams below, they were expected to move beyond the French right and threaten the road leading back toward Vienna. Napoleon would then have to retreat or fight with his communications endangered. The idea of attacking a weak flank was not absurd. It used the Allies' numerical advantage and aimed at a result larger than the capture of a single position. It also matched the evidence their headquarters believed it possessed. The danger lay in what the plan assumed. Davout had to arrive too late to reinforce the French right. The southern columns had to move through narrow ground without serious delay. Napoleon's centre had to remain passive while Allied troops left the heights. The Pratzen position had to remain recoverable if circumstances changed. Different formations had to keep to a demanding timetable, and the French had to behave like an army preparing to withdraw. None of those assumptions was impossible. The plan became fragile because several of them needed to remain true at the same time. Wayrother had converted the coalition's preference for attack into a coherent operation. He had also created a plan that left little room for an enemy who acted sooner, reinforced faster, or attacked somewhere else. On the evening of 1 December, Wayrother's plan passed from the headquarters table to the officers expected to execute it. Some senior commanders received its full explanation only hours before their troops were due to move. Several columns had to leave the Pratzen Heights during the night, descend by different routes, and reach the south in the correct order. Russian and Austrian formations shared limited roads, while cavalry, infantry, and artillery could obstruct one another before the battle began. These difficulties did not make the operation impossible. They made timing essential. Yet the Allied command system was poorly suited to rapid correction. Kutuzov held formal command. Wayrother had designed the movement. The sovereigns remained nearby, and each column commander controlled only part of the operation. If a road became blocked, a formation arrived late, or the French attacked the centre, changing the wider plan required authority and information that were not concentrated in one place. The orders explained where each column should go. They offered less help once events departed from the timetable. During the night, the Allied army began moving south. The plan remained coherent on paper. Its ability to adapt had not yet been tested. At dawn on 2 December, the Allied plan began where intended, against the French right. The first columns moved toward Telnitz and Sokolnitz, committing large numbers of troops to the villages, streams, and low ground south of the Pratzen Heights. The French defenders were outnumbered. They gave ground, counterattacked, and fought repeatedly for the same approaches. This was not a harmless demonstration arranged by Napoleon. If the Allies broke through quickly, they could turn the French flank and threaten the road toward Vienna before the rest of the army responded. Davout's Third Corps therefore became essential. After a forced march from the Vienna area, its leading units reached the southern battlefield during the morning. They did not remove the danger immediately. Their arrival allowed the French to reinforce threatened positions and prevented Buxtehuden's forces from turning pressure into a decisive advance. Timing now mattered on both sides. Allied delays gave Davout's men time to enter the fight. French resistance kept the southern columns engaged after they had left the heights. Napoleon's deployment had not made his right secure. It depended on that wing surviving long enough for the Allied movement south to create an opportunity elsewhere. By mid-morning, the French right remained under severe pressure, but it had not collapsed. Napoleon did not order an immediate attack on the Pratzen Heights. He waited while more Allied troops moved south, and the fighting around Telnitz and Sokolnitz continued. Once the centre appeared sufficiently reduced, Soult's corps advanced. The divisions of Saint-Hilaire and Vandamme climbed toward the heights, but they did not find an empty position. Allied troops resisted, and Kutuzov attempted to organize forces nearby before the French could secure the ground. The struggle in the center remained uncertain long after the first French units reached the crest. Even possession of the heights did not end the battle. The Russian Imperial Guard counterattacked, forcing Napoleon to commit reserve cavalry and French Guard cavalry. Only after further fighting did the French stabilize their position and prevent the Allied center from being restored. To the north, Bagration faced pressure from Lens and Murat, but retained enough control to withdraw much of his force in reasonable order. The Allied army had not suddenly become incapable of resistance. Its local commanders could still fight, counterattack, and retreat. What the headquarters could no longer do was combine those actions into one operation. The southern columns remained engaged around the villages. The center was fighting for the heights. The northern wing was being pushed away from both. The loss of the Pratzen Heights mattered because it removed the point connecting these separate battles. Wayrother's plan had been designed to turn the French right. After the French broke through the center, that plan no longer existed as a unified action. After the battle, Austria moved quickly toward peace. Russian forces withdrew, and on 6 December, France and Austria agreed to an armistice. The Treaty of Pressburg followed on 26 December, removing Austria from the Third Coalition and strengthening France and its German allies. The victory did not bring a general peace. Britain remained at war. Russia accepted no lasting settlement, and the political order of Central Europe changed again in 1806, when the Holy Roman Empire ended. Austerlitz also became more orderly in memory than it had been on the battlefield. Napoleon's bulletins emphasized control, timing, and the sun breaking through the mist. The later story of masses of Allied soldiers drowning beneath shattered ice enlarged a real but disputed episode into an image of total destruction. The victory was genuine. Napoleon identified the decision the Allies were most likely to make, encouraged it, and exploited it with exceptional skill. But success still depended on Davout arriving, the French right holding, Soult attacking at the right moment, and the reserves defeating the Allied response. The Allies chose battle because it appeared to offer a rapid solution to their problems. Napoleon's achievement was to make that choice serve his own.